This lecture will cover the causes and outcome of the Spanish-American War. Take a minute to write down the key terms listed here. The first three terms should be defined before you watch the video to help you better understand the story. During the late 1800s, the United States began to expand its territory. After the Civil War, the U.S. became more involved in foreign affairs, especially those that had an impact, either direct or indirect, on us as a nation. The first real test of our military strength after the Civil War came in 1898. Cuba, a small island 90 miles off the coast of the Florida Keys, was in a state of turmoil. They were a colony of Spain and were feeling neglected by their mother country. Since 1868, Cuba was in the midst of a revolution against what they perceived to be Spanish misrule. Their economy was in shambles, their infrastructure, which are roads, buildings, and all the inner workings that make society function on a day-to-day basis, was falling apart. Spain, being over 3,000 miles away, had a difficult time taking care of and controlling her unruly colony. The Cubans had had enough and were demanding their independence. They looked to the United States for help. The United States was not interested in helping the Cubans at first. Cuban rebels began to burn down U.S.-owned businesses and plantations in Cuba in order to get our attention and hopefully persuade us to intervene on their behalf. American businessmen who were losing profits due to the anarchy in Cuba tried to persuade the U.S. government to step in and help the Cubans establish a truce to end the fighting. Still, the U.S. did not think that getting involved in the Cuban-Spanish conflict was worth our time and resources. A series of events soon changed our attitude about Cuba, starting with a report published by Senator Proctor, who visited Cuba to assess the situation. While there, he uncovered the horrific treatment of Cuban civilians, those who were not rebels, but rather innocent bystanders in the Spanish-Cuban conflict, mostly women and children. They had been sent to re-concentration camps by the Spanish military to prevent them from joining the rebel causes. While in these camps, they contracted diseases such as malaria and yellow fever and suffered from malnutrition. 200,000 Cubans died in these re-concentration camps. Senator Proctor's findings were reported in American newspapers, sending shockwaves throughout the nation, who began to sympathize with the Cuban civilian population and therefore started to see Spain in a not-so-flattering light. Next, a nasty letter written by the Spanish ambassador to Washington, Dupuy de Lome, revealed how lowly the Spanish government thought of our then-President William McKinley. The letter called McKinley a low politician who was weak and catered to the rabble. The letter had been stolen and published in U.S. newspapers. The sensational U.S. press that had been engaging in yellow journalism in an attempt to gain more readers took the opportunity to exaggerate the situation and turn something that seems rather silly and insignificant into a big deal. To some, the audacity of the Spanish government to talk smack about the U.S. president was enough to seriously consider siding with the Cubans in a fight against the Spanish. This is why many feel that the press pushed the U.S. towards war in an effort to create more headlines for their papers. There are also more indirect causes that led us to war with Spain. For one, the U.S. government became increasingly concerned that a European power held control over a territory so close to the U.S. Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Key West, Florida, making the presence of Spain a possible threat to our security. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was a policy of the U.S. that stated that we would stay out of the affairs of Europe, but Europe had to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This was an effort on our part to establish ourselves as the dominant power in the West, although most European countries chose to ignore it. The U.S. government, however, planned to use the Monroe Doctrine as justification if we ever chose to force Spain out of Cuba and therefore out of the West. The U.S. also had their eye on expanding overseas for the sake of finding new markets for our manufactured goods. Industry was booming at a high rate and America didn't have enough consumers for all of these goods. China was the hot spot for countries looking to expand their economic sphere of influence. Many European countries and even neighboring Japan began to carve out areas of China that they wanted to control. The U.S. wanted to get in on the action and gain access to China's then millions of consumers, so we suggested an open-door policy in China in which all countries would have equal access to these consumers. But being so far away made it difficult for us to flex our muscles in the fight for a piece of China. If we could gain access to a small territory close by, we could keep our eye on our interests in China, and their consumers would be within arm's reach. The Philippines was the stepping stone we needed to China, a territory that was owned by none other than Spain. If we could beat Spain and gain control of her territories, the Philippines would be ours and access to China would be easy. These islands would also serve as a much-needed naval base and refueling station for our superior navy. Even though the U.S. government felt they had enough grounds to go to war with Spain, public support was not as enthusiastic. While some sympathized with Cuban civilians suffering in reconcentration camps and others were angry with the sensationalized Delaune letter, most Americans didn't see a valid reason to go to war with a major European power. Like many people today, Americans didn't support war unless there was a direct threat against our security. In February of 1898, that direct threat happened. The U.S. sent the USS Maine to dock in the Havana harbor in Cuba in order to maintain peace and order. After a few weeks at harbor, the ship exploded early in the morning. Over 250 American Navy servicemen were killed. Immediately, the finger was pointed at Spain. It seemed obvious that the culprit was Spain. The country made it clear she didn't want the U.S. getting involved in the conflict with Cuba. Once again, the sensational yellow journalism of the time painted Spain as the murderous villain with the blood of U.S. sailors on her hands, despite the fact that an investigation had never been conducted. With the public crying, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," President McKinley felt that he had no choice but to present an ultimatum to the Spanish. His demands were that we wanted compensation for the destruction of the USS Maine, an end to the concentration camps in Cuba, a truce in Cuba, and Cuban independence. The Spanish agreed to all but one, Cuban independence. Since an ultimatum is an all or nothing proposition, the U.S. was ready to officially declare war on Spain. War began in May 1898 with an attack on the Manila Bay of the Philippines. In just 7 hours, the U.S. Navy destroyed the entire Spanish fleet. Meanwhile, in Cuba, U.S. troops sank every Spanish ship attempting to escape Santiago Bay. In all, the war only lasted about 8 months, earning it the nickname the Splendid Little War. Even though 2,500 Americans died, fewer than 400 died in battle. Most died from diseases such as food poisoning, yellow fever, malaria, and improper medical care. As a result of the war, research conducted by Major Walter Reed helped us find a cure for yellow fever. The Treaty of Paris in 1899 set forth the results of the American victory. When the U.S. drafted its war resolution against Spain, we made it clear in the Teller Amendment that we would not annex Cuba once the war was over. We kept our promise and gave Cuba her independence. However, we did lay out some conditions to that independence in the treaty. The Platt Amendment stated that Cuba must allow the U.S. to maintain a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, intervene whenever we feel it necessary, and forbade Cuba from entering into any foreign agreements. In addition, the U.S. gained the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines for a total of $20 million. Puerto Ricans were eventually granted citizenship under the Jones Act of 1917 and received much-needed funds to rebuild their infrastructure and improve education. They were pleased with the results of the war, unlike the Cubans who had mixed feelings about a conditional independence that gave the U.S. a big brother-like role in the country. Many people debated what the role of the U.S. should be after the Spanish-American War. As a country founded on the principles of freedom, who once fought for our own independence, it seemed hypocritical for us to become a colonial power and engage in imperialism. Some anti-imperialists believe that expansionist behavior went against our nation's founding principle of liberty for all. They believe that our constitutions should follow our flag, meaning that the people in any U.S. territory should be given the same rights as ordinary American citizens. Other anti-imperialists believe that racism was at work. They believed that many white Americans felt superior and used this belief to justify taking over other races. The major dispute regarding our new position as an imperialist nation came in the Philippines. Filipinos believed that the U.S. was fighting to free them, too, from the rule of Spain. They quickly realized, however, that we had no intention of leaving. Unlike Cuba, the Philippines became a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War. To justify this, President McKinley stated that the Filipinos were uneducated and unfit for self-rule. He basically called them savages who needed the U.S. to civilize and Christianize them. He didn't know if the Filipinos were already Christians, so he sounded kind of stupid in making this claim. Although the real reason we annexed the Philippines was for our naval base and access to China, the U.S. government promoted more humanitarian reasons to justify annexation. Once the U.S. annexed the Philippines, a brutal 3-year war broke out. Filipino rebels led by Emilio Aguinaldo fought relentlessly to rid themselves of American troops. After the death of 16,000 Filipino rebels and 200,000 Filipino civilians, the rebels gave up. The U.S. continued to own the Philippines until 1946. The war itself was nothing special, but the consequence of the war would be felt for generations and still stir up debate on the role of the U.S. in foreign countries. In class, we'll be taking a look at the various perspectives regarding the outcome of the war to better understand the significance of it. Make sure you answer the think questions and try the extra credit questions in digging deeper. You do not have to write a summary for this video. Have a good night.